You could smell the iron and the inevitable human scream long before you ever saw the glow of Pittsburgh in 1880. Forget the sanitized postcards. This was Hell's Forge, a place where progress was measured not in tons of steel, but in the gruesome calculus of daily sacrifice. The official records, those polite little ledger entries, whisper about 1 death per day inside the mills of Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. 1 worker, pulverized, burned, or simply vanished into the slag heap every single morning. The truth? That number is a cheap lie, a statistical convenience. They stopped counting the moments that truly mattered. The lost limbs, the blindness, the slow, agonizing asphyxiation from the mill dust that coated every lung like concrete powder. The mills weren't factories. They were high-speed human reduction units. They demanded everything. Here is the fundamental reality that sentimental historians ignore. The deaths were not accidents. They were tuition fees. They were the brutal, necessary cost of transforming a backward agrarian society into the industrial engine that would dominate the 20th century. Pain was the only teacher they respected. If a man hesitated, if he valued his fingers over the speed of the line, the machine taught him precision with absolute finality. This wasn't malice. This was refinement. This was the ultimate Darwinian quality control, ensuring that only the most hardened, the most desperate, or frankly, the most broken men kept the molten flow moving. Do you flinch at that blunt assessment? Do you prefer the soft comfort of tragedy over the cold, hard logic of historical necessity? Then you probably shouldn't be here. But if you value the raw, unvarnished mechanics of power and the unflinching truth of how empires are actually forged, then you belong in this space, demanding that we look closer. We have to understand that the men who survived were not lucky. They were chemically changed. They were tempered steel themselves, surviving heats that would have broken anyone else. Imagine the atmosphere. The 20-foot Bessemer converter tipping its white-hot liquid steel, 50,000 pounds of screaming gaseous fire, a dazzling spectacle that guaranteed instant, agonizing oblivion if you slipped, if you coughed, or if the heat simply fried your brain at the wrong moment. The ambient temperature around those furnaces was a steady 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and you wore thick wool and leather. Hydration was for the weak. Safety railings? A joke told by management to the insurance adjusters. The only thing that mattered was tonnage. More steel, faster, now. And that pressure created a unique toxic psychology. Why did they stay? People always ask that, acting as if these men had choices beyond a Hollywood movie script. They stayed because this brutal labor, this daily flirtation with being melted down to your component molecules, was the highest paying ticket out of utter starvation. They were trading life expectancy for immediate survival. Simple arithmetic. They knew the cost. Every morning they walked through the gates of the homestead works, fully accepting the contract. A roof over the family's head for the very real chance of being incinerated by 5 o'clock. This acceptance, this stoic, quiet resignation to the tyranny of the flame, is the psychological bedrock of industrial America. We built our bridges and our skyscrapers not on invention alone, but on a massive mountain of sacrificed human tissue. And we rarely talk about the specific brutality of the methods used to enforce that sacrifice. Not the general risk, but the tools of death. The true tools of death were not merely the fires, the sheer overwhelming heat that cooked a man from the inside out. No, the real instruments of sacrifice were the worn gears, the constant crushing fatigue that turned a 4-ton girder into an invisible wrecking ball. They were the cracked ladles that management swore they'd fix next quarter. Every man in that mill knew the weak points of the infrastructure better than the engineers who designed them. They tracked the shrapnel patterns from previous boiler explosions, mapping the potential disaster zones like grim geographers of industrial risk. If a high-tension belt snapped, it didn't just stop. It flayed whoever stood nearby in a sickening blur of leather and frayed fiber. Fast, painless, never. The air itself was toxic, corrosive, yes, eating the lungs, but it was also eating the very integrity of the machines, pushing the whole operation toward inevitable, spectacular failure. This constant engineered decay was the actual cost of profit margin. You, sitting there, comfortable, watching this on a flat screen, imagine answering to a man whose only metric for your human worth was whether your output justified the potential cost of your future medical amputation. That is the foreman. He wasn't hired for his compassion. He was a creature of cold optimization, a human bottleneck, incentivized by bonuses tied directly to eliminating delays and maximizing the tonnage output for his shift. Delay meant discipline. Discipline often meant termination. Termination meant your children starved. Simple algebra of cruelty. We must confront this. The men inside the gate were controlled less by the danger of the job itself and more by the terror of losing the paycheck that funded the meager life outside the gate. If you find this cold, clinical dissection of American industrial mythology uncomfortable but absolutely necessary, if you prefer complexity and harsh reality over the comforting bedtime stories we tell ourselves about the past, then this is your intellectual high ground. You belong here, demanding this deeper accounting. You should be subscribed. The greatest lie they sold wasn't the falsified safety record. It was the mythology of the meritocracy they enforced. They told these immigrants, these farmers stripped of land, that this was the path upward. But that ladder was greased with sweat and blood, and it usually only went one way, down into the furnace pit. Now consider the enforcement mechanisms of fear. The Pinkertons were expensive, heavily armed muscle, hired not simply to break strikes that had already started. Their deeper function was to instill a deep, bone-level paranoia that kept revolutionary whispers silent, long before they became screams. They weren't just security. They were psychological anchors, ensuring that the worker, already broken by the 12-hour shift, was also spiritually terrified of his neighbor. That is how you maintain a truly brutal system. You make the victim doubt everyone, especially himself. You make the mill not just a work site, but a political prison disguised as opportunity. And the foreman? He was the warden. The man who knew exactly which of your relatives lived in the company housing, which meant he knew exactly what leverage he held over your spine. The system wasn't built on efficiency, it was built on calculated fear. Forget the myth of the rugged individual earning his way. The rugged individual was trapped. He was shackled by the company housing, the rent pulled directly from the meager wage before he even saw the cash. That cash, in turn, bought goods at the company store, marked up 50% above market price. It was a perfectly closed loop of economic enslavement. You got paid today only to guarantee you were broke tomorrow. Debt wasn't an accident of finance. It was the mechanism of retention. Nobody ever walked away clean. That is the fundamental difference between honest labor and industrial captivity. They called it a job. It was a lease on life, payable daily, non-refundable. Now we must peel back the psychological layers of this horror. We are only scratching the surface of this manufactured misery. The intricate psychological warfare used to maintain this dominance is still hidden beneath the romantic dust of history, obscured by bad Hollywood movies. If you're ready to dig past those glossy, standard narratives, if you absolutely refuse to settle for the simple, comforting answer when the truth is complicated and dark, then you must ensure you don't miss what's coming next. Don't be that viewer who settles for less depth. This channel delivers truth, not comfort. The foreman wasn't merely managing schedules. He managed despair. His true power lay not in hiring, but in assigning the risk. Favoritism was lethal, simple as that. The mill wasn't just dangerous, it was a hierarchy of assigned fatalities. There was the relatively safe job, stacking inventory maybe, and then there was the hell job, the coke ovens, the blast furnace lip, the work that guaranteed silicosis or third-degree burns within the year. The foreman was God, dispensing life and death with a clipboard, choosing who got the temporary reprieve and who got the slow-motion death sentence. This arbitrary, capricious power, the ability to ruin a man by simple task assignment, was the true engine of compliance. This cultivated uncertainty forced the worker to become his own executioner. You didn't trust the union organizer because the foreman had eyes everywhere. You didn't trust your neighbor because he was likely angling for your less lethal job assignment. Snitching wasn't just encouraged, it was a pathway to minor survival perks. Cutting corners on safety wasn't laziness. It was the only way to meet impossible danger. The company never pulled the lever. The worker pulled it himself. The greatest irony is that the Pinkertons and the armed guards were only required because the company understood deep down that the economic gravity they created was not enough to guarantee eternal silence. They knew the rage was there. They knew that a man pushed far enough will risk starvation for dignity. But they worked diligently to eliminate that dignity first. They stripped the worker of language, forcing them to learn English immediately or face demotion. They stripped them of community, strategically mixing immigrant groups, Poles next to Italians, Czechs next to Irish, to fracture potential alliances, seeding confusion and mutual distrust in the boarding houses and the barracks. They destroyed the soil from which collective action grows. But the fear was never perfect. The strikes still happened. The explosions still occurred. When the disaster finally struck, when the boiler blew or the mine shaft collapsed, what was the company's first priority? Protection of assets, never the bodies. The official inquests, funded by the very companies being investigated, inevitably arrived at the same conclusion. Worker error, always. It was always the fault of the man who died, the one who could no longer speak up to defend his own name. A dropped tool, a moment of inattention, a failure to follow a procedure that was physically impossible to follow under the 12-hour pressure they enforced. This corporate gaslighting was the final insult, ensuring that even in death, the victim was made to bear the shame of his own sacrifice. You die, and you take the blame with you. That is the final, definitive verdict on American industrial mythology. It was never about building a nation. It was about efficiently consuming human lives and then erasing the evidence. The mythology survives because we want it to. We desperately need the story of the rugged individualist, the self-made man who pulls himself up by the bootstraps. A lie so potent, it cleans the blood right off the gears. It's cleaner. It means you don't have to look too hard at the real calculation. That true American enterprise was predicated on the calculated annihilation of the self. To survive that life, you had to become something else entirely. You had to master a specific, terrifying philosophy just to clock in every morning. This was the Stoic hardcore. Pain was currency. Endurance became the only achievable faith. The industrial machine didn't just demand your labor, it demanded your soul's silence. You were forced to operate in the realm of the completely inevitable. You stopped dreaming. No man in the steel mill truly dreamed of a better house. He dreamt only of making it to the whistle without missing a finger. That was the total extent of ambition. Pure, cold, utterly practical survival. Forget the grand narratives. This was simply existing in the deep end of economic gravity. Now, look closely at how the entire system enforced this resignation. They paid just enough to keep the body functional, but never enough to afford the luxury of hope. Hope, see, is debt. Hope is a terrible liability when you need perfectly obedient, replaceable cogs. They manufactured dependence through the company store, through the company-owned boarding house, through the script money that could only be spent back into the company's coffers. Circular debt. You were born owing them, and you died owing them, frequently in a spectacular, regrettable accident, ensuring the debt was never truly settled. This was the perpetual economic prison. You there? Listening to this, don't pretend you know what that pressure feels like. To know, definitively, that your life insurance policy was valued by the superintendent at less than the market price of the machine you were cleaning. This constant threat, the knowledge of your own redundancy, it forces a terrible psychological reduction. You can't afford complexity. You cannot afford emotion. You become simple. You become the hammer. the tool. You internalize the degradation because the alternative, rage, rebellion, dignity, means certain, immediate starvation for your family. The system wasn't designed to uplift you. It was designed to force this psychological surrender. And that, right there, is the true legacy of American grit. Not ambition, but brutal, necessary resignation. It's the stoicism of the damned. They weren't heroes fighting for some grand ideal. They were just men who learned the hardest, most necessary lesson the machine could teach them. Suffering is the undeniable baseline. Anything less is a delusion you absolutely cannot afford to carry into the 12-hour shift. If you had hope, you were weak. If you complained, you were fired. If you cried, you were ignored. You had to eliminate the excess of your own humanity. That constant self-pruning created a man devoid of the soft edges we now associate with freedom. They achieved a kind of frightening freedom, yes, but only the freedom of having nothing left to lose. Everything was already taken. This is the dark heart of the American dream we consistently refuse to acknowledge. We glorify the struggle, but we forget that the struggle was never intended to be won by the worker. It was intended only to consume him efficiently. The worker's only victory was waking up the next day, and that was immediately negated by having to report back to the mill. You think unions changed everything? They certainly slowed the bleeding. They put brakes on the most egregious abuses. But the fundamental lesson had already been imprinted into the culture. The corporation controls the narrative of sacrifice. The worker learned that justice is something you fight for every single day, and even then, you probably lose. They learned that the pain never stops. It merely evolves. We traded Pinkertons with shotguns for economic insecurity and optimized redundancy, but the core mechanism remains identical. Pressure until fracture. The pressure is just invisible now. It's internalized. The men who built this country understood the truth we avoid. The system requires your misery to function. It demands a sacrifice, and you, the disposable unit, are that offering. The pressure is still there, you just call it burnout now. We traded the deafening clang of the steel mill for the silent, always-on hum of the digital economy. But the extraction model is identical. Look closely at your own life. You were trained by the ghost of that hardened man, the one who stared at the foreman without blinking, the one who worked through the severed finger because the insurance paperwork wasn't worth the lost hours. That man is the ancestor of your internal monologue telling you to answer emails at 11 p.m. He taught us the language of necessary resignation. He showed us that the true enemy isn't the corporation, but the soft, demanding part of ourselves that still believes things should be fair. That belief is an expense the system cannot afford. It must be liquidated. Every ounce of modern anxiety, every sleepless night dedicated to optimizing your own productivity, every self-help book preaching resilience, it's all residue from the great industrial lessons of the past. Resilience is just a fancy word for not shattering when you absolutely should. The machine is pleased with your resilience. It means you can handle more weight. It means the system is operating perfectly. They say the American dream is about upward mobility. Nonsense. It's about downward spiritual trajectory, a progressive acceptance of diminished returns on your humanity. The system requires emotional debt service. It needs you to be just desperate enough to show up, and just exhausted enough not to revolt. That perfect balance of demoralization and commitment is the true output of the American industrial experiment. Now, here is the verdict, the immutable truth. The foundational lie of this culture is that hard work leads to freedom. It doesn't. Hard work only generates profit for those who already control the mechanisms of labor, and it generates the kind of weary, beaten stoicism required to survive the next round. Pain was the teacher, and the lesson was submission. The worker never won a freedom. He merely perfected the technique of his own consumption, finding a strange, dark nobility in the act of being ground down to the bone. You, the modern inheritor, are still living that painful, perfect legacy. You think you're fighting for success? You aren't. You are fighting the primal urge to finally stop hurting. And the ultimate tragedy is that, like your ancestor in the mill, you've probably already learned how to suppress the pain so well that you don't even recognize the fight anymore. You just keep working. This is the final irony. Listen close. The system, that vast churning mechanism, does not care about your success. It only cares about your sustained input. Your exhaustion is a feature, never a bug. It confirms compliance. The price of your daily bread isn't just hours. It's the quiet, progressive erosion of your will to redefine what life should be outside of production metrics. You mistook a sturdy cage for a sturdy character. You saw your suffering as a moral virtue, a necessary purification rite for the modern saint of productivity. Nonsense. That pain was just the lubricant. They sold you self-improvement. You bought a muzzle. The final, horrifying truth is this. The only victory possible now is the recognition that the fight itself was rigged. Freedom, in this context, is not a destination you earn through labor. It is the sudden, chilling realization that the work ethic you were given is simply the most efficient anesthetic the system has ever produced. You confuse the numbness for contentment. You confuse commitment for captivity. And you keep showing up, carrying the historical burden of your ancestors who truly suffered, applying their grit to the vastly less noble task of optimizing a spreadsheet. They taught you how to bear the weight. They didn't teach you the only thing that matters, how to drop it. They never will. You, standing right here, right now, are the perfect machine, pain contained, submission internalized. The legacy is complete. Now, go back to work.